Erik, Chapter 12. I watched Christine leave the dressing room, her shoulders drooping with exhaustion. She pulled the door shut behind her, and I dropped my hands from the spinet behind the mirror. Her voice still rang in my ears, long after she had departed. I had been utterly at a loss for a few weeks now as to what I could say to make her performance any better. I decided it was time to see how she could perform under stress. I began to set plans in place for her debut upon the opera stage. As it turned out, I was not the only one making plans. I was surprised to learn, on one of my nocturnal rummages through Lefebvre's office, that he planned to retire. I unearthed a notarized bill of sale of the entire opera enterprise to Messieurs André and Firmin. I had no idea who these two men were, but apparently they fancied themselves artists, as a handwritten note attached to the bill of sale noted that no artistic manager was to be engaged after Lefebvre vacated the post. These two men planned to do everything themselves, it seemed. I reflected that this would be the perfect opportunity for Christine's first performance. It was nearly certain that Carlotta would make up some excuse to storm out, in an attempt to establish dominance over the new administrators. But she did not know that Christine stood ready to take her place. The new managers would not know that Christine really only was paid to be a secondary dancer, and they would have no artistic manager who ought to know that either. She could assume a much greater importance within the opera company in one fell swoop, if only she survived her audition and gave at least one decent performance. I hoped for her sake that the commensurate increase in salary would suit her. One morning, I found myself a comfortable spot to watch the rehearsal on the stage, perched high up in the flies above the stage. I had spent hours up here in the past weeks, learning what ropes were connected to what pieces of equipment, which catwalks led where, and how the scene pullers manipulated the giant pieces of painted canvas that were used as backdrops for the operas played out on the stage. The bright lights of the stage did not reach up this far, and I was often able to stand within arm's reach of one of the stagehands without them realizing I was there in the gloom. I watched below as a musical director, Monsieur Rayet, stopped the rehearsal to harp on one little musical detail that didn't meet his satisfaction. Christine completely ignored him, as she had no part in solving the problem he complained of. I watched her fondly from above as she took advantage of the break to plop down on the stage and stretch out her long legs. As expected, Lefebvre strode in with André and Firmin, showing them around their newly purchased opera house. I had guessed they were likely going to interrupt this rehearsal, as I had seen them meeting in the manager's office earlier, and realized Lefebvre was preparing to take his final leave of the building. The rehearsal was where everyone was gathered, and it was only logical that the three gentlemen would stop in there to make introductions all around. The new managers began to fawn over Carlotta. From the sound of it, they had been audience members for many seasons, and so they saw her on the stage constantly. She had been with the company for 19 seasons. Up close, her face was starting to look aged, but she had a brilliant makeup artist that made her look perpetually 21 as she walked the boards of the stage. No one knew how old she really was. Her voice did not betray her age either, as she and her astronomically expensive vocal coach worked hard to keep it in top form. I listened as one of the new managers coaxed Carlotta to perform for them. It wasn't that hard to do, I thought to myself with amusement. Carlotta would always perform at the slightest bit of flattery. Monsieur Rayet sat down at the piano to accompany her, and together they launched into a song. I knew the song intimately, as Christine and I had been rehearsing it for weeks. My fingers wavered in the air before me as I automatically reached for the notes of the piano accompaniment. Suddenly, I felt excitement shiver down my spine as inspiration struck me. I finally had an idea of how to cause Carlotta to back out of a performance, leaving an opening for Christine. I looked around me, measuring the position of the great canvases against where Carlotta stood on the stage below me. If I released one from its moorings and sent it plummeting to the stage, It just might be enough to spook Carlotta away from the theater for an evening. I could see the area where it would land, just behind Carlotta and completely clear of people. I reached for the end of the rope that held the whole arrangement suspended and unraveled it from its mooring. Just as I took my hands off the rope, sending the whole thing slithering to the ground, Carlotta had the misfortune to step backward as she strutted around below. The leading edge of the canvas, sewn around a heavy iron bar, missed her as it struck the stage, but the bulk of the canvas sprawled out to either side of the initial impact. Carlotta got caught by it in the back of the knees, and she was flung to the stage. I cringed inwardly at the accident and watched as people sprang to her aid, lifting the backdrop away from her. She got to her feet, unharmed, but livid with rage. Pandemonium had struck everyone on the stage. Everyone except Antoinette. Instead of focusing on Carlotta, her gaze swept upward to where I was standing. I nodded my masked head at her, raising my eyebrows significantly. The message I had no time to convey, the message I was hoping to send to her telepathically with my raised eyebrow was this. If Carlotta storms out, remember to insist that Christine sing for the managers. She is ready. It is time. I turned with a swirl of my cloak and left before anyone else could begin searching the flies for the source of the accident. As I left, I heard the people on the stage questioning Bouquet, who they felt should have prevented the accident. I headed for my box 5, and just as I entered it and seated myself, I saw Christine standing in the center of the stage, clearly petrified. Antoinette had done her duty and insisted that Christine have her chance to sing, and the managers had acquiesced. The opening notes of the piano introduction sounded again. Christine looked too frozen to open her mouth and sing, but then instinct took over and she made her entry on time. Her voice was thin and weak in the grand space of the auditorium, and the other company members on the stage began to shift and whisper behind her. I leaned forward as if getting closer to her could somehow coax her back to her full vocal glory. Finally, her voice began to bloom as it warmed up, and she began to make the grandiose movements that accompanied the music. It was truly odd to hear the polished voice of an opera singer coming from the lithe, scantily clad form of a dancer. She finished her impromptu audition, and silence descended on the auditorium. She stood with her eyes closed in the center of the stage, savoring the moment. She looked like she was thinking she would never again get to stand there and sing, so she needed to remember how it felt. Then, chaos erupted as everyone swarmed up to her, commenting and exclaiming over the hidden talent she had just revealed. She was borne away backstage, surrounded by the musical director, the wardrobe mistress, a makeup artist, a hairstylist, and the choreographer. Each of them needed just a moment of her time in order to prepare her for the evening's performance. Since Christine had never been an official understudy, she had never rehearsed with the company in the main role. There was a lot to prepare her for before the curtain went up. I left my box, headed for her dressing room. As I walked, I felt the grin of exultation on my face at her success. I got to her mirror door and moved my wall away from the back of the panel. A wave of noise and confusion washed over me as I viewed the scene on the other side. Christine stood in the middle of a swarm of people. A woman took her measurements and scurried away back to the wardrobe department. Monsieur Rayet insisted she sing through the rest of the entire show, holding the score before her and pointing out places where he would direct her to do this or that. A makeup artist tried out various shades of powdered blush on her constantly moving face, trying to find the best shade. Her hair moved, seemingly of its own accord. As a hairstylist, I could barely glimpse through the throng, brushed and arranged it for her performance. Everyone moved around her with measured urgency. They seemed to know that they were operating under a tight deadline and had planned every action to fit into the time constraints. It was amazing to watch. Christine was stripped down to her corset and dressed again in brand new costumes that seemed to have been conjured out of thin air. I gazed at her hungrily from behind the mirror, drinking in the sight of her skin and cursing silently whenever someone else's hovering form blocked my view. Finally, the last person departed, and Christine sank to the stool at the dressing table. She was dressed in her Act 1 costume, and several other hastily but expertly sewn costumes hung on a rack behind her. Her face was made up in the heavy makeup that would let her facial expressions be seen by everyone in the auditorium. A knock at the door informed her that the curtain would be rising in 15 minutes. She thanked the callboy, and he continued to the next dressing room. She turned back to the little mirror at the dressing table, and I heard her speak.
Father, I did it. I will be singing on the opera stage tonight. For you, Father. I miss you, even still.
She bowed her head. Whatever else she had to communicate to her father's spirit didn't pass her lips. I held myself still behind the large mirror, determined not to intrude on her private communion. She raised her head again and asked,
Angel? Angel of music? Are you here?
I replied, Always, Christine.
What do you think about the way Reye wants me to sing the first aria in Act 3? It's not the way we practiced it. What if I accidentally sing it my way instead of his?
She sounded worried. I didn't hesitate. Sing it however it feels natural. You have the musical talent to make it sound great, no matter how you sing it. Don't second-guess yourself. The great artists never do. Reye will make the orchestra follow you. That's his job.
But what if I trip while I'm walking on stage? That would be terrible.
She was working herself into a nervous frenzy, I could tell. I wanted to step through the mirror and take her by the shoulders to calm her, but I didn't dare to. You're second-guessing yourself again, I quietly reminded her.
But what if—
Stop, I interrupted her. Just stop. Everything will be fine. Remember, you have been trained by the angel of music himself. She took a deep breath, then jumped to her feet as the knock of the callboy came at the door. It was time. I retreated to my box 5 and settled in to watch. The first part of the show passed quickly until the moment when Christine made her first appearance. As she stepped on stage, a murmur rippled through the audience. They had come expecting Carlotta, and though they had been warned by their program, they still felt surprised by the substitution. They all hushed suddenly as she stepped to her place and steadied herself to sing. The first note that came from her throat was perfect, and every note after that matched its perfection. I felt my shoulders slump in relief as the music unfolded from her, and it was every bit as lovely as it had ever been in our dressing room. As she got over her initial stage fright and realized that her training would carry her through, she began to relax and let her personality show through. Her eyes began to sparkle, and her voice got still richer as she let the playfulness of her character shine. Her aria drew to a conclusion, and the audience went wild. Every single patron leaped to their feet and stood applauding her for 5 minutes, cheering and shouting her name. The auditorium rang with the cry of "Die! Die!" Finally, the ushers were able to restore some order, and the audience settled back into their seats. The story of the opera began to play out on the stage again. Her second aria was even better than the first one, if that were possible. And the third was even more sublime than any she had yet sung. Tricky technical passages and long, sustained notes flew by, perfectly executed. The end of the opera neared, and I could see at least 20 men gathering their walking sticks and hats, prepared to rush backstage after the curtain to offer her their compliments and see what the prospects for romance might be with her. Christine launched into her last aria and sang through it until the last note. She had almost completed the required 16 beats when she fainted. She collapsed to the boards of the stage. Reye signaled frantically to the curtain pullers, who released the ties holding the curtain back, allowing it to swing in and hide her from view. I leaped to my feet and raced through the secret passages back to her dressing room. I got there just as the door opened, and 2 stagehands carried her in and laid her on the chaise. They were followed by the theatre doctor, Madame Giry, and at least 15 male patrons of the opera. As the door swung shut, I could tell from the crowding and noise in the hallway that there must be at least another 30 on that side of the door, and more arriving every minute. One man tried to take charge of the chaos. While he tried to calm the noise, I pitched my voice low and threw it to the pillow behind her head and said, "Christine." I watched her eyelids flutter and knew that she recognized my voice and knew I was there with her. I was too focused on Christine to notice at first, but as the man gradually got the room cleared of extra bodies, my attention flicked to him. Astonished, I realized that it was the man from the party, he who had so fascinated Christine from across the room. Soon the doctor, Christine, and the mysterious man were alone in the room. Christine heaved a deep breath and her eyelids fluttered open. The doctor gently explained to her that she had fainted on stage and she had been transported here to recover. Her gaze moved to the other man and she froze. She locked eyes with him. I could see years of shared memories pass between them in that gaze, and surmised this must be someone she knew from her childhood. They exchanged innocent-sounding words of introduction and regret for her affliction, but in their voices I could hear the shared years they had had together, and a mutual desire to renew their acquaintance. I felt a sudden chill of fear. This was the suitor I had to watch out for. A man who could claim such a long acquaintance with her already had the key to her heart, and needed to do very little to win her. I developed an instant hatred for him. I again whispered in her ear, "Christine." She whirled but saw no one behind her and turned back to the man, suddenly pale.
Ral, I must ask you to leave me now. I want to be alone.
He seemed almost offended, but rose to leave. He asked, "Are you coming to the party in the foyer? It's already begun, and I'm sure they're all dying to toast your success." She paused for a moment.
I will come if I can.
He had to be satisfied with that. He kissed her hand and turned for the door. The doctor packed his bag to leave. He closed the door and silence fell over the little room. I couldn't contain myself. I was filled with nervous energy after the appearance of this dangerous prospective suitor, and it exploded out of me in an outburst. What an insolent man! No, not a man, a boy. Did you see how he was dressed? What a ridiculous dandy! Coming around here trying to make friends with you just because you sang well. How absolutely presumptuous and rude! I was pacing in agitation behind the mirror. Christine sat in the dressing room, carefully neither agreeing or disagreeing with me.
Angel, what did you think? I thought it sounded strange toward the end. The more I tried to relax, the more tense I became. I think that's why I fainted.
She sounded a little worried. With difficulty, I dragged my mind away from the threat of this Raoul and cast it back to the performance she'd given. "No," I said eventually. "I think it was probably nerves and the after effects of stage fright. And I don't think you ate anything before the performance either. I think the next time you sing, you'll be completely fine." She sighed and let her shoulders slump as I removed this worry from her mind.
Angel, I must thank you. Without you, I would not have dreamed I could have done what I did tonight. Not only did you give me the training, but you also cleared my way to the stage and put me there. I am so grateful. And if you speak to my father again, please tell him thank you, too, for sending you to me.
She hesitated, then continued. She spoke hurriedly, as if she was afraid she would lose her courage.
I like to see people when I thank them. Look them in the eye. If you're real, please, come in here so we can finally meet.
Well, you couldn't get a much clearer invitation than that, I thought to myself. I clicked the lever that opened the mirror door and slid it aside. She snapped her gaze to the mirror and stared at me. I couldn't blame her. How often does one look into a mirror and see a cloaked, masked, hatted figure staring back instead of one's own face? She rose and moved closer, her mouth hanging open a little in astonishment. She reached a hand out to me, but stopped her hand mere inches from my own outstretched hand, seemingly afraid to touch me. Suddenly, across the room, a knock sounded at the door. I heard a man's voice call her name and try the doorknob. I knew it wasn't locked, and we had mere seconds before the man at the door entered and beheld me, her, and my secret door. She turned her head toward the door and froze. I took advantage of her surprise to capture the hand she had extended, pull her urgently through the mirror frame, and slide the glass quickly back into place behind us. I pulled her close to me and clamped my hand over her mouth as the door opened in the dressing room. Raoul strode in with a newly purchased bouquet of roses in his hand. He looked around the empty dressing room in puzzlement. He raised a hand to his head, scratched it comically, laid the roses gently on the dressing table, and backed out of the room, confusion written all over his face.